Hello and welcome to the Madecast, the official podcast of the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment, a series of lectures on video game history as part of the Made's ongoing effort to preserve history through teaching and displaying playable exhibits of rare games and consoles.
But life in the time of COVID has forced us to close our doors for now. The support of people like you has allowed us to continue to bring history to you through lectures and interviews like the one you hear in a few minutes. I'm Jun.
And I'm Red. This week, we are covering the Game Boy. It was one of the most popular systems of all time, and it left a very long-lasting mark on games in general. It is an exciting system to touch on and get a little bit of give you all a little bit of history about.
And it is technically the portable gaming console right on my generation.
Same. That was like, I was born a little bit after the first Game Boy, but grew up with Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance.
Yeah, the Game Boy Advance Special was my very first gaming console.
Yeah, it's mine was, I believe mine was the PS2, but my second was the Game Boy Advance, the original Game Boy Advance, and it came with Pokemon Crystal. That was quite a time, but I'll tell that story once we get to the system in a little bit. But before we do that, we have a little bit of news this week. Nothing major has been happening in the news department regarding mini games, but we have a little bit to touch on.
So, by the time we record today is 27th of April here, and this is the 30th anniversary for Kirby.
This is a big anniversary. I mean, it's pretty cool that about a month prior, they've released
the latest Kirby game.
Kirby and the Forgotten Land.
Fun, by the way.
Yes, it does look like a blast, and I really want to give that a shot in a little bit. But there's other expenses in the line first before another Switch game. We have, like, Kirby has left a gigantic mark on Nintendo and is pretty much their second most popular mascot behind Mario. So happy anniversary, Kirby, and we hope to see you again in the future very soon.
Yeah, the pink devil.
Yeah, little pink devil, the pink glutton. Overwatch 2 also has their beta start today, as of this recording, the 27th of April.
Yeah.
So we will, that's exciting. If you can get a shot at it, I would recommend doing that. I might also do that later today. But the only other, get your hands on it while you can to check out the beta and see what the game's about. Last little bit of news we have is the Bethesda Games launcher has began to shut down, and you're now able to start transferring your games over to Steam. So if you ever use that, although I don't know many who did, give it a shot.
I'm actually surprised they did it like earlier, but actually now, because I like it's 2022. I think most of stuff on Steam already. But it's a good move.
I agree with you that it's a good move. It needs to be, probably should have been done a little bit sooner, but it is what it is. It'll all be passed down. Just like everything, like you said, it could be bought on Steam already. There's no real reason to use the games launcher. There wasn't really any essential benefit to it that I ever saw, but didn't really see anybody try to use it. But let's get started with the Game Boy. So, the initial release of the Game Boy. Imagine it's 1989. The Nintendo has been the Nintendo Entertainment System has already been released, and has the Super Nintendo been released yet?
Not yet. So what happened is they have Family Computer, which is called NES in NA, released in 1983. So the background of the Game Boy is that they have opponents in the market by the time, which is Mega Drive, as known as Genesis, and PC Engine. So in
Yes.
order to compete with those opponents, they are actually making SNES, which is also called Super Family Computer in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
They're developing it, and meanwhile, someone in Nintendo they say we gotta make a a portable gaming console which allows a player to play multiple games instead of like Game Watch. There's only one game in the console, and there comes the idea of Game Boy.
Yeah. The game like it was like it was invented by Gunpei Yokoi, and he's been like a consultant and developer for Nintendo for years and years prior. He was the one who created the D-pad on the original Famicom NES. So to see them do that with a portable system, there was already like a bunch of success with the Game and Watch series of handheld games, which were individual games that you could just pick up that were like black and white screens, and it was one game with one handheld console.
Yeah, very. It's a very interesting fact that the Game Boy when it's in development is actually not very well received inside the Nintendo company because they're thinking like we have NES already, we are making Super NES, and now suddenly all in the middle we gotta make a monochrome portable gaming console. They don't really think the consumer will like about it.
Yeah, but they were supremely surprised by their success. It was one of the like quickest selling consoles of all time, and also just a lot of people who didn't have like a regular home console got these instead. So it was, but the Game Boy was very pioneering. It had like a contrast bar, the original one. Game Boy is like, it had a contrast bar. It had 4 AA batteries in the back, so you could last anywhere between 10 to 15 hours. On the release of the original Game Boy, I think it was about 40,000 units were sold on the release day in America. So like it quickly became one of Nintendo's greatest consoles and releases of all time. In fact, it's the third most possible. The Game Boy and the Game Boy Color, the base consoles, were the third most popular console of all time. But including the later versions of it, like the Advance and the Advance Special, it's crosses over 2 million and is easily the most sold, most popular console of all time.
Yeah, I think by the time the Game Boy was sold like $89.99 too, which is not quite a big amount compared to what we pay for a portable gaming consoles nowadays. I mean,
Yes.
technically the only one left is Nintendo Switch, but you know.
Yeah, the Nintendo. I mean, yeah, with the cease of sales of the DS, which was like the successor to the Advance, but to the Game Boy, there's no real handheld competition at the moment. It's now I mean, the Steam Deck is taking many strides from the Switch in the fact that it's like you can put it on a dock and then you can bring it with you, so you can play it on a screen and you can play it on the go. It's like the handheld gaming scene has not been the same since the release of the Switch, which was kind of like the regular portable game killer. But the Nintendo Game Boy was like very pioneering for its time. Easily portable, which in regards to like some of its competitors like the Neo Geo portable handheld and the Sega Game Gear, which were a lot chunkier. The popularity of the games was a big thing about Nintendo's Game Boy as well. Like Sega had the Sonic games, but not a lot of other popular games that really broke through as well as Nintendo's titles have. But Nintendo released the Game Boy with Tetris and Super Mario Land in North America. The big thing that ended up selling a lot of the Game Boy was the original Pokemon games, Pokemon Red and Blue. You can't really talk about the Game Boy without talking about these games because these were it was such a huge like advancement in just what people like expected from portable games and everything like that. The ability with the link cable was originally with Tetris, so you can like play against somebody in Tetris at this like in the original release of it. But with the release of the Pokemon games, which was like a marketing genius thing to release two versions of the same game, and then you, in order to like complete each game, you needed to connect with somebody else or buy both versions of the game.
I think it is safe. You can say the Pokemon game series is always evolving together with the Nintendo consoles.
Yes, like the Pokemon series has been a staple ever since the initial success on the Game Boy. But the Game Boy was also like just super strong, lasted all the time. I mean, people would drop those things all the time, and there was not an issue. It there's no surprise why it was such a huge success. I mean, at the time they were skeptical, but the price point and just the games that were available made it a very enticing console to have. There was also a lot of other like peripherals. I mean, it was a monochrome screen that didn't have any light behind it, so then they added one that had a light.
They do, in fact. So after the release of Game Boy, they actually make two different versions of Game Boys before they have a next generation of it. One is called the Game Boy Pocket, which they, of course, just as a name, they make it a more compact version of Game Boy. It's
Mhm.
at around, I think, 1996. And another version, which is more special, and I don't think you can find many of them because it's only released in Japan. It's actually called the Game Boy Light because the original Game Boy has no backlit for the screen, so it's pretty dark without any source of
Yes,
light.
it's very difficult to
And
see one of the original Game Boys.
and very funny, it's released on 1998 only in Japan, which is 6 months before the next generation of Game Boy being released.
Yeah, they were really just they were not they were already had other plans in mind with the Game Boy Color. The Game Boy Color ended up being a 16-bit console. So with the release of the Super Nintendo in '92, like there was already like a series of 16-bit and even 32-bit games from Sega with the Saturn and everything. With the Saturn and even the 32X for the Master System, which is another interesting peripheral. It was the '90s was a big time for just different peripheral plastic items to attach to all of your consoles. It was very it was very like you had to be there kind of thing. I mean, there's still a little bit of like peripherals that you can get for games nowadays, but
yeah,
the '90s was peak. You
you can
also
say it's the golden age.
yes, and then the Game Boy Color was also released with the next generation of Pokemon games, Gold and Silver, which were some of the most popular games. It was a 16-bit console with a color screen, hence the name Game Boy Color. It was like their major competitors were the Neo Geo Pocket and the SNK, the Wonder Swan. No, the Neo Geo Pocket by SNK, and then the Wonder Swan, which was also released in Japan only. But after the design of the Game Boy and the Game Boy Light, the Gunpei Yokoi left Nintendo, and then they left Nintendo, and then they went to design their own console, which featured two D-pads on the same side, as well as an A and B button. That was released in Japan only. Did not receive as big of a joyous reception overseas or anything. There was no plans to release it in America or Europe, but it was just amazing to see how he went on to do something else. But then Nintendo ran with it with the color.
Yeah, and then also the competitors also make a color version, but they're no match for Game Boy in terms of dominating the market by the time.
Yes, the spread that Nintendo had with the Game Boy across like Europe and North America and Japan was nothing compared to was like so large and like pervasive compared to any of the other competitors. With the Game Boy Color, the popularity was a bit waning, and so they wanted to jump ahead into the future a little bit. So they released the Game Boy Advance in 2001. This was the 32-bit console with a 2.9-inch screen that was a bit widescreen as well. So like the quality of games on the Nintendo, and it also added an L and R shoulder button.
Yeah, it was by the request from the game developers because they really want an L and R buttons, so they finally added.
Yeah, they finally added it, and it was a large. It was a great hit to like advance the gameplay. That was probably my, like I mentioned earlier, the Game Boy Advance is where I really dove into it. I did get to play Super Mario and Tetris on the original Game Boy a few times, but those were always like at my older friends' houses that they had those. The Game Boy Advance was my big entry into this, and I brought that thing everywhere. Being able to play that on car rides and play Pokemon. I got really into the Mega Man Battle Network series for the Game Boy Advance.
I, s- I still remember those days I was playing like Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, which is already the version with colors and better qualities of graphics already. I would just bring it everywhere with me on
Oh my
transportation,
God,
and then
yes.
I'll bring it to school and play it under my desk while I'm having class.
Yes.
All those times, those are some good times.
Yep. Yep. You yeah, you hide. Yeah. I was a leaf green person myself. Uh I I really loved the original, and then the original Fire Red and Leaf Green.
That's my first ever gaming console and my first ever Pokemon game.
Yeah, they are uh, it's such a leap. Uh I remember just spending so much time with the Advance, and then friends with like again with the peripherals, like a magnifying glass clip that stood like 4 inches away from the screen that magnified the screen a little bit, and then you can have a separate little dongle light that like plugged in and was just angly and weird. Uh, it it was a very incredible console, and then just with the release of like the third generation of Sapphire and Ruby, again, just the like bringing it everywhere and trading with all the kids around that you could find. Just it was such a great uh it was such a time to actually bring consoles around.
And I think the evolution on their audio device is actually quite a big help on pushing all this stuff to be such great, because like in the previous few generation of Game Boy, they are only be able to produce analog sound with a, I think it's a pulse generator, and there's a 4-bit PCM sample channel, and then there's also a noise generator, and that's it. But they also available to output stereo sound, which is, I think it's pretty impressive for the time. But for the Game Boy Advance, they actually finally be able to add digital voice
Mm-hmm.
in the Game Boy.
Yeah, it
So
was.
I say it's a very huge improvement.
Yeah, and it's really amazing just because of like the limitations of those of what you're able to produce with all that compatibility. Produce some really memorable soundtracks for everything. Like I still have the Mega Man theme songs stuck in my head.
Oh, oh.
Like I mean, just like all the sounds and everything else. Like they really nailed getting like they really just nailed the feeling of getting everything together. It's like the sound and creating a world and like a really catchy loop of tracks that you could not really get tired of the more you like all you play. Yeah, it's really incredible. And then the other advancements technologically with the color, I mean, it was able to show like over 32,000 colors. It had a dual CPU, so it can play the games of the original Game Boy and the color. But with the advance in the feature as well, it was able to play everything backwards along with that. 2 years after the release of the Game Boy Advance, which was another game which was not backlit, which was also interesting because like they did release the Game Boy Light in Japan, but it took them until the Game Boy Advance the special which was like a clamshell flip phone looking game console, which was one of my
That
personal
is actually
favorites.
my first ever game console, and
The special was you didn't have the original Game Boy
Yeah.
Advance.
Yeah, I didn't own the original one, but I owned the Game Boy Advance Special.
Did you get the original? Like there was the original one that had like a front lit screen, and then there was a backlit screen on like an advancement of it, which really brightened the colors a lot better than the front lit screen, which was just kind of meh. Because I had the first round of it with the front lit, which definitely didn't get.
I think I have the second round with a backlit.
That's I was always envious of the dudes who had those. It was like, it looks so much better. Like you could actually see everything.
Yeah, I just don't know whether it's still working or not because the last time I remember trying to play it, I can't save any game. And
yeah, I had an issue with my Game Boy Advance. At least it came with Pokemon Crystal, but when I was playing Crystal, there was I think the save battery in the cartridge was dead because at a certain point I was playing and then it wouldn't maintain the save file. So that was always a bit rough because I would lose my level 26 Croconaw. I got it to level 32, or I evolved it to Feraligatr once while just I had to leave it in because you couldn't wirelessly charge it on the original Game Boy Advance. It was a 2 AA screen, but then if my save battery wouldn't save, then I wouldn't have time. I think I had a very very time frame to swap out batteries.
Talking about batteries, there's a fun thing about the Game Boy Advance Special is that they no longer use the battery that they used to be using. Instead, they finally moved to the lithium battery instead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they finally moved to a rechargeable battery system, which was a lot easier. I mean, it was a bit pricier of a console for the time, like over $100, I believe, for the special. But having it recharged and not having to buy packs and packs of batteries all the time was definitely a bit better and less wasteful. There was just so many other. I just remember so many good times with the Game Boy Advance SP. It was a very big staple of my gaming as a child, as well as like with the anniversary of Kirby. Nightmare in Dreamland was my big Kirby game. Yeah, that was. Yeah, I 100%ed that game really hard. Kirby, that's another game that's just stuck in my mind with all the soundtrack and everything about it. It was an amazing system and very much of its time. And then, sadly, in 2005, the last version of the Game Boy was released, called the Game Boy Micro. They wanted the Game Boy to be the most compact. They downsized the screen again to a 2-inch screen.
It is really very tiny.
It wasn't a They just wanted to make it like super portable, but then they sacrificed like the enjoyment of what the the special kind of was to me.
Yeah, it also wasn't. It is also no longer able to play the older games because of how small they have to make. They have to take out some components that allows the hardware to play some older games, even though they still have the dual CPU inside to run the games, but it is just lacking other components of it.
Yeah, it was yeah. I mean, I have fairly large hands, and I never was able to really enjoy playing with a micro. I had two people that I knew had one, but then it was, yeah, they didn't really touch it. They ended up just playing their special a lot more.
But one fun thing I think they add is the function to adjust the light level of the screen.
Yes. For all the previous backlit ones, it was either on or off. You couldn't really adjust the brightness. I mean, which was kind of interesting because with the color and with the original Game Boy, you had a contrast bar that you could change. That you could adjust the contrast depending on like what level of light you're in and make it more visible. The advancement of the light level would have been better on some of the other consoles, especially this. Like I do think the special would have also had a great one, but I believe it was in 2006 or 2007 when the Nintendo DS was the next generation of handhelds from Nintendo that was taken off a few years later. It had a dual screen. It had a touch screen on the bottom. It was able to play Game Boy Advance games from the bottom, and then the new Nintendo DS games on top, which was pretty incredible because it was also a 64-bit handheld system, so you could play like Super Mario 64 on it, which was one of the big release titles. But the Game Boy
That's
was
another story.
Yes, that is another story for another time.
Jesus, to me it feels like yesterday.
Yes, it's the Nintendo DS was a whole nother story and like a whole nother time. But the Game Boy was the big pioneer of handheld games and was the clear star of the handheld series, and definitely left its mark on gaming history. And its mark on my heart.
Yep.
It'll forever be one of the greatest consoles ever released. And if you once you come into the museum, once we're back open again, you can get your hands on one of the originals and give some of these classic games a start. Even see some of these peripherals that you can light up the screen and have fun with. But the Nintendo Game Boy, the Game Boy Advance ceased production in the mid-2000s. And
6?
Yes, I think 2006 you weren't able to get any brand new Game Boy Advances. But there was many other handhelds that came from the inspiration that the Game Boy gave to the rest of the gaming community. So we salute you, Gunpei Yokai, as well. Thank you for designing this amazing console, and rest in peace. He unfortunately passed away in 1997 in a traffic accident. But the Game Boy still lives on in our hearts, and all of your innovations as well. So I think that's it for the Game Boy history for this episode of The Maid. But let's talk a little bit about what we've been playing recently. I mean, neither of us have been playing a ton of things. Life has kind of gotten ahead of us, and we've been...
Yep, but I do pre-order tons of stuff from my Nintendo store.
Oh, yes. So what are some of the things that, like, let's do what you're looking forward to play most at the moment?
So I first pre-ordered Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak, which is the latest expansion of Monster Hunter Rise, which will be released on, I believe, 29th of June. That's the first game I pre-ordered. And then I was looking at Xenoblade 3 and Splatoon 3. And when I was about to purchase both of them, which is quite a number, I also remember Nintendo has actually an offer for the for the members of the online plan, which allows you to buy 2 games with the price of about $100.
That's a decent discount for some Switch games. So
Yeah, and it's not only 2 games; it's 2 new games.
yes, that's
So I can get both Xenoblade free and Splatoon free with just a price of $100, which is, I think, it's a very valuable trade.
that is a very good price. I would
Yeah.
absolutely
If
agree
you
with
think
that.
about the
Like,
Xenoblade free, I think it sells about $70 to $80. So
yeah, it's the next. I'm looking forward to the Xenoblade as well. I never got too into it, but this one looks really fun. Um, I haven't pre-ordered anything as of yet. My big interest to get is the indie game Outer Wilds. That's my next kind of more interested purchase. And it's not a big one, but I'm just still waiting to take care of a few other things before I pull the trigger on it. I'm also going to be going to my other set of series of games that I'm really interested. I've just been playing Elden Ring a little bit more. Getting further and further, it is still I'm like the size of this game is just so ridiculous.
I mean, Soul game is Soul game.
Yeah. I mean, even for a Souls game, I mean, it's like 3 or 4 times bigger than Dark Souls 3 was. And I thought Dark Souls 3 was a big game. It's like I'm very much enjoying my time with the game. But I've also just been playing a lot of tabletop games recently. Like,
oh, that's great.
Yeah, getting into Flux, getting into some Munchkin, playing my old standby cribbage, getting into some more like in-person games with some of my friends as well. But I think that's about all that we have for this week about what we've got going on. We want to thank you for listening to the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment's official podcast. If you have any thoughts, questions, corrections, or general museum ideas, please shoot us an email at info@themade.org.
We'd like to send out a big thank you to everyone who donated recently and to our Patreon supporters who keep the Made afloat. Patreon donors get to listen to this podcast 1 week before it's released on major streaming services, and we continue that with future episodes every week.
This week's episode was brought to you in part by Patreon donors Chase Azimi and Matt Gorse. Thank you so much for your support.
Until next time, I'm Chip.
And I'm Red. Thank you, and we will see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Later, gamers.
It's just us this week, so
I know.
I gotta cut it.
Okay.